Hello, everybody. If you can all hear me, I just want to make sure you can all hear me. I am, hello. I am live tonight with American Elitist, somebody I know on Twitter, or X as it's called now by Lord Elon. And tonight I think we're gonna talk about, or at least discuss, kind of the need for, or the ideas of a modern nobility, because I think, as we can see today, there's three kind of major factors with modernity that make me convinced that we need a monarchy. Number one is, as I've pointed out in my old video on why I'm a monarchist, I think it's, at least for most societies, the most natural and best form of government, because it's based on the family tradition and it reflects the divine order with God, and God is the king. uh, the second being that I think democracies tend to just have people vote for whatever is in the interests of the people who naturally become elites already. And as we've seen with, say, votes in Ireland, that with the abortion thing, that people will actively vote against their own rights. And number three, and most pressing, is that our current elites and ruling class are completely insane. And to the point where you can't even sound like a conspiracy theorist anymore, because however evil you describe them as is probably going to be accurate. Like people like Klaus Schwab dressing like a supervillain, and George Soros, and the only way you could describe the people that rule us, their actions, is that the most accurate way of describing it is that these people are implementing policies to destroy the human race and human spirit. And so I think it's high time to actively start discussing an alternative, and with me is American Elitist. How's it going?
Oh, it's going good. It's a wonderful evening on the East Coast tonight. Very nice evening.
Mm-hmm. Oh
I
yeah,
had to have
you're
a
on the
break
East
from the
Coast too?
humidity. Sorry, what?
You're on the East Coast too?
Yes, I live in North Carolina currently.
Okay. I'm in upstate New York. I've mentioned that before, but enjoying the fall weather and the coming fall weather. But yeah, so just kind of want to tell me a bit about yourself or your channel. We can kind of get started with I've kind of introduced us.
Yeah, sure.
Uh,
So me
Also,
personally,
can everybody hear him? I just want to make sure of that.
yeah, you should be able to hear me. My mic's on. Pretty good audio settings there.
Yep.
But me personally, I'm a Zoomer, of course, in case you couldn't tell. I'm a product of the early 2000s, and that's kind of my environment and cultural reference points and viewpoints. And kind of how I got in this sphere originally was I just like life just started to go downhill. And I kind of realized the promise that I was originally given in the early 2000s was just not happening, and that things were actively getting worse. And I couldn't quite figure out why, because everyone said things were going just fine. Liberalism had triumphant, democracy, full equality, everything, racism is dead, This was the post, like, George Bush years, rah rah, American patriotism high type of rhetoric during that period.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, of course, it still felt off to me, and I couldn't figure out why. But then, like, as soon as Obama got in, that's when things dramatically went downhill for me and my standard of living quite a lot, at least for my community and people, which is white Southerners. And then, like, the rhetoric just, like, shifted dramatically out of nowhere to being like, we actively hate you, and you're evil, and all of your kind needs to be punished for the past sin of slavery and things like that. And it was just this visceral hatred that dramatically shifted for me, and like, and then Gamergate happened, of course, in like 2017, 2018. That's kind of what led me to this sphere originally, and many iterations later, that's why I'm here right now.
Mm-hmm.
This is right. But on my channel, specifically, I have guests on, wonderful high IQ guests, and we discuss a variety of topics from history, philosophy, religion, and I do some edited content, and I have some good stuff in the works, so you should go check that out on my channel.
Yeah, I think after this I'm gonna start binging your videos because a lot of the topics seem cool as well. So
They're really good. You should definitely check them out in case you haven't.
Yes, and I've linked your channel in the description. So yeah, and I think it's safe to say that like you tend to view more traditional ideas of government, i.e., monarchy, aristocracy, as more of a beneficial form of government, or to me, it's just like because I'm in a similar situation. I guess I might be a little older than you. I consider myself more of a younger millennial. That I also kind of grew up in the early 2000s, and just what our generations kind of saw with like 9/11, the war in Iraq, the just kind of disintegration of a lot of social norms that's just been ramping up and up in the past 20 years. It really shows, you know, it's left a lot of people asking the questions of, well, why? You know, why was the great promise of the 90s not happening? And the new atheists had a solution was, well, it's just because of religion, you know. Well, religion is why the terrorists crash planes into buildings, and why like the evangelical televangelists are annoying and all that. But obviously, society's become less religious. Things have actually just gotten worse and worse. There's like that meme, right, of the you know, if we had an atheistic society, we will, without religion, will be a more rational society. And then, well, our society now believes that men can become pregnant, so I guess that's out the window. But as I kind of said in the introduction, that what is become more apparent to me is because early on it was a little bit more of my edgy kind of early college years of like, well, you know, everybody still has to believe in democracy, but what if I'm like, well, I want to be for monarchy? You know, like, I think that's a cooler form of government. And then I took it more and more seriously because a lot of people say, like, oh, you know, king would be nice and all, but then it's like nobody wanted to take that step of taking the idea seriously. And, you know, if you read a lot of the ancient philosophers, is it just seemed to fit as the natural form of government. And you know, the idea of a meritocracy, that we won't have any elites, is just not true, right? It's you're going to have a ruling class one way or another. Like, you even look at the American and French revolutions, as neither of those would have gone anywhere if in America, if you didn't have effectively the American aristocracy, um, be it the Virginia planters or like the New England intellectuals. Oh, or the French Revolution, which happened to be, you know, angry peasants, but it was egged on by completely insane, psychopathic bourgeois intellectuals. And it's why ideas of populism just won't work, right? that you can't.
No, that they really won't.
Like, no protests ever get anywhere unless either A, they're loud enough that they force change to happen, which in that case it's no longer a protest, it's an all-out revolt, or if they're already tacitly supported by the ruling class.
And like the civil rights kind of the 1960s kind of really should have shown this to people. When the popular people in the South resisted by actively protesting, like forced busing and forced integration in schools. And the U.S. government sent armed troops with bayonets to break that up quite quickly.
Yeah, that's become an iconic. Now, early on, of course, as a kid, you learn about that, and you're like, "Oh, it was great." You know, they said we're gonna make those evil racist Southerners, you know, integrate. But now you look at it more, intently, and you're like, "Well, this is basically the government saying this is a good social policy we want to implement, but the only way to implement like this liberal idea is by force, is literally at gunpoint."
And that's how most like elite policies are pushed forward. What the populace actually wants is kind of irrelevant. And you see this with like, and there's many examples you can go through this, but like, you know, I'll just bring up a classical one, like gay marriage, right? When I was growing up, gay marriage was not accepted. It was not tolerated at all. It was the minority position. This was in the early 2000s. but of course, elites in like Harvard, Stanford, the university system, and like the upper middle class and elite class supported these ideas. And so, despite what Christian America and Middle America thought about this issue, and you could see the polls switch conveniently in 2015, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that like it was forced through anyway through the court system, the Supreme Court, through Hodges, and basically through manufacturing consent, through propaganda. They basically forced
Mm-hmm.
that issue anyway, and that now that's the new normal.
Well, yeah,
Essentially.
and you have and you yeah, to the point where you now have people that call themselves conservative, who 20 years ago would have been vehemently against it, now say, well, it's a settled issue. And thing is, even where it's not, it wasn't, because in a lot of these cases, it's just done by the court system or parliament. Like it is the people, the ruling class always is going to get it through no matter what. If they can't get it through a popular vote, then they'll get it through a parliamentary vote. If they can't get it through that, they'll just do it through the court system. And in Ireland, they were able to do it, but again, that was mass propaganda. And like, Ireland's a country I feel very bad for, despite, you know, being a predominantly and proudly of English heritage. Like, that country has been screwed in so many ways. And the sad thing is, like, just after they traded being under the yoke of British rule just to walk openly into liberalism and destroy their own country that way. Like, mass immigration and liberal propaganda is destroying Ireland faster and more potently than hundreds of years of British rule ever could.
No, you could just see like what the population wants and what actually happens is just radically different. And like
Mm-hmm.
this has just been so observable to me, right? This is the
Especially
first.
immigration, right? Is poll after poll after poll shows people steadily, consistently, in Europe and America, want less immigration, and no matter what conservative government gets elected, like even like essentially, which is a massive betrayal in Italy, right, where populist anti-immigrant rhetoric, Meloni comes to power and immediately backslides on immigration, despite everybody wanting less. The and the problem is, I think, in my conversation with the distributist a few weeks ago, like the problem is that the economy can only work and the social security system can only work if there's an expanding class of younger people. But the sexual revolution has ruined the family formation so badly. The only way you can do that is just by harvesting millions of people from the third world. And so it kind of creates this, essentially you just have people have to argue now, and the same people that will say, oh, we need those people to do the jobs we won't. And it's like, so you're saying that the only way the economy works is if we have a permanent brown underclass. And it's like, that's such a victory for liberalism, isn't it? You have to have an implicit racial hierarchy in order for the economy not to collapse.
Yeah, this is kind of the greatest indictment of the system, right? Like if liberalism was this great success as these philosophers and like, libtards, as I'll call them, want
Mm-hmm.
to make it out to be, then what we see is the native populations of those countries would be having tons of kids, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they'd be thriving, right, under liberalism, which they proclaim as like the greatest philosophy to exist, post French Revolution, right? Going
Mm-hmm.
back to like, the natural state of man, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like we
That
see the exact opposite. Birth rates are the lowest they've ever been throughout history. People are committing suicide more than ever. They're depressed. They're fat. Like
mm-hmm. They're addicted to
they don't
drugs.
believe in the society, and that's why they're not having children.
It's that, and they can't even afford to. Right? It is they
Even
can't.
if they wanted to, yeah, they can't afford it either.
Which, because it's in the vicious cycle of, well, we gave all of the housing to immigrants, so, but there's now still a housing crisis, and people can't make new people anymore, so we're just kind of bringing more immigrants. And, you know, if that's not an outright condemnation, right? I was thinking about this as Louis XIV on his canons. I think it was Louis XIV had inscribed in Latin like the final argument of kings, and I'm like, I think I would just say as a change to that, I would show a picture of like Justin Trudeau and like uh, Klaus Schwab and those people, and just say
Rishi
this is
Sunak.
yeah, this is this is the final argument for kings, right? It's the current elite ruling class that in some is supposed to be representative of a democratically elected system are basically doing absolutely everything that the worst stereotypes of monarchs and nobility said they would be doing, right? Like the nobility in France never told the poor people you should eat bugs, right? They never said you. It's like not only do they, it's like are they saying that you should be poor, but you should thank us for being poor and having no family.
Well, yeah, it's even worse than that though. Then they use like, you know, gay language, like, to dress up what's actually happening. Until you're gonna live in the pod and be happy, right? And like everything's gonna be rented out, essentially in your pod.
You'll own nothing, and like people always say, well, feudalism was bad because the peasants didn't own their land. I'm like, well, the modern peasants don't own it either. Like home ownership is dropping, is consistently dropping. People own less and less of things that they have, and everything is becoming like a pay per service. The idea of you having something that isn't part of the system, and what makes it worse, right, is again, as I said, it's not even conspiratorial thinking now. It's really the people that rule us, since they've killed God, or at least they've removed God from our society. Like they don't have they don't have any higher moral authority to answer to, or to like at least try and attribute themselves to. And so now, and you have these people that are just getting so old. Like Henry Kissinger is over 100. You have these. You have like it's a geriocracy, as I call it. It's the rule by these senile people that are close to death, as we can see with with Joe Biden. And I feel like a large number of them are just like, well, if there is no God and the only thing that we think we believe in is pleasure, well, the end result is just, okay, we want to hook ourselves up to a singularity dopamine machine or plug our brains into jars and have robots just kind of harvest resources across the universe until the heat death of the universe. That's the end goal of liberalism if you're a secularist. That's like, is that really the future for humanity that they want? Something that's basically even worse than the Matrix?
I mean, no, at least for a sane person, that's not what you would want. But even worse so if you're a religious person like me.
Mm-hmm.
And we already see right now, like, what that future would be like. It's absolute hell. People are not happy in that system. Like, and we even see this with, like, Canada, right? Which is the most progressive nation on earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they have to implement, euthanasia laws because people are so checked out of the system and they literally won't want to check out of life, which is like the greatest self-indictment of your system, where more people want to check out of your system than want to, birth new generations into it.
And not only do are people so kind of walking corpses in the system already that the solution is not to help them, but to just end them. And it's like it's like these same people will turn to you and say that it'd be wrong to do this to the drug dealers, but it's fine to do it to the drug users. And it's like, I'm just trying to scratch my head and think of, has there ever been a monarch in history that has ever treated their own population with this much contempt?
I can't think of a single one.
King Herod, maybe.
All of history.
Henry VIII, maybe. Although Henry VIII didn't even... He hated... I mean, he was... I have a lot of bad things to say about him, but, like, I don't even think he wanted to genocide Catholics in England. And, like, I remember there was a debate that the Distributists had a few weeks ago with Counterpoints, right? And he was, like, making this bizarre argument that, people like Charlemagne were carrying forth, like, the Roman tradition of republicanism. And, like, well, in England, you didn't have, like, kings getting their head cut off because of liberalism. And I thought, no, you did. His name was Charles I, and Cromwell cut his head off. Like, the one time England didn't have a monarchy, it became this insane, puritanical dictatorship.
No, and it's just this pure ignorance for his position, right? It was called the English Civil War, buddy.
Hmm. Yeah, this
There's many other conflicts throughout history that just like destroy your argument without even having to dig into it very
hmm
hard.
and the point about Charlemagne and republicanism is it's like, okay, yeah, obviously Europe has a long, still in a lot of ways has that void of Rome, and so many countless people have tried to fill it, and Charlemagne was one of the earlier ones, but obviously he didn't give a fig for republicanism, because what is that going to do for like the people in France and Germany? It's like what the people in France and Germany needed was stability for Christians, their safety, and somebody to make the Vikings and the Muslims go away. Like, how does republicanism address that? It doesn't. What does is a strong warrior king.
Well, yeah, or just like a strong centralized authority that like actually cares about its people, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they have incentives to care about the population they rule over and like their well-being, right? Because like they're the outer face, like I am the government, right? You know, King Louis, the Sun King, famously said, "I am the state."
Which, in a way, is
Right.
less kind of scary than you might think compared to today, because then at least there's a person to that, right? It's who is the French state. It's this man. We have his portraits, you know? We sing prayers, we say prayers for him at Mass, right? He's the king. What is the face of the government now? And, I mean, it has the mask of Joe Biden, but nobody believes he's in power. He's a very clearly senile, corrupt old man, and nobody believes it.
No, he's a corpse that they parade around on puppet strings to
Mm-hmm.
keep this like circus going.
It's
No
like,
one in like who actually knows how the government actually works believes he's in charge.
and they wouldn't want him to be in charge. Like the only I feel like the sad thing is the only thing that's probably protecting humanity from the insane kind of older technocrats is that they have to give way to the insane younger leftists who are so incompetent they won't be able to make any of this happen.
Yeah, that's kind of the duality of the system, right? Where the newer, diverse upbringings that they're bringing into Western countries are not competent enough to keep the wheels on the system going.
Well, it's not even the
So things
immigrants,
just break down.
it's the theater kids graduating from colleges. It's the rainbow people.
Yeah, it's the diverse coalition. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's like these people can't be expected to actually run anything. Like you had that woman a few months ago who like almost lost the Voyager space satellite. And
And nobody's surprised by that story in 2023.
no, the thing is like you've also noticed is there's no hope for the future. Like there's nobody can think of like, oh, what's it gonna be like 50 years from now. No one has a rosy picture of like the flying cars and like the space skyscrapers and all that. No, people I don't even people don't I think it's because people don't even want to have a vision of it, because they if they did they'd have to start asking themselves, well, why does our picture of the future look so bleak?
No, right? You think they would ask themselves that question?
Mm-hmm. And so it kind of brings to mind the idea that like, you know, there's this great image, right, of like that encapsulates a lot of modernity, where you have like the riot police in the full body armor in front of like a pride parade, like having to protect it for some reason, and it's just like overlaid of it is just the caption, "We killed kings for this," right? And it's, you know, we all know if the founding fathers saw what America turned into, none of them would have. They would have either said, "Okay, no, we need whatever is not as illiberal as possible," or "We should never have revolted if this is." It's like, what was the point if this is what it turns into? It's like you have the most prosperous area of land in the world that is surrounded on either by like weak neighbors to the south and north and oceans to the east and west, and they still have a society that completely collapses in on itself.
No, that should be an indictment of itself that like this like land that like has like almost perfect geography, right? Perfectly defensible, has like plenty of natural resources, rivers, water, farmland, fresh ocean water, all the type of things you need to run a strong civilization, and yet our elites can't manage that with all these built-in advantages, and they just run things into the ground.
And it's, in a lot of ways, it just seems to be on purpose at this point. Like, there's really no other way you can rationally understand it. It's that these people have no investment in the people they rule over, not morally, because these people don't believe in God, and they don't believe in, like, even like classical Confucianism like has this concept, right, that the ruling class is the ruler of the over the subject is basically the same as the father over the son. And like, as illiberal as this sounds, which it is that if you had a government that saw itself more as a paternalistic figure, they would be vastly less hostile to their own population. And again, the point is that you can also just see that the reason why populism fails is because, again, these people have no backing to it. There's no ruling class that's supposed to take over. And like, look at the Republican candidates, excluding Donald Trump, because he is a weird exception. But all the other ones, the ones that would be in a normal race, is like, imagine this presidential race and Donald Trump wasn't in it. Look at the people on the stage at the debates and just ask me, do any of these people exude any concept of like rulership? Like, I don't want a man of the people. I want somebody who says, I am in charge and I'm going to rule. Right?
Yeah, otherwise you get these like foxes who are essentially put in charge, right? And we know foxes rule and govern, right? And they're inept at using force, right? But they're not afraid about using other interest groups against the populations for which they rule over.
And foreign countries, right? The idea that, well, we want Ukrainians to die so we don't have to send our own sons to go fight the Russians is just so uh, flippantly evil. Like, the neocons, like, how can you even consider these people human in terms of how they act? And I'm just like, and it brings to mind of like why I think a lot of the monarchist structures started failing. And I almost feel like it was failing when kings stopped being warriors, where it ceased. You weren't expected to be like, it used to be, right, that the king was a warrior king. Richard the Lionheart, Charlemagne, uh, they all had to be in the military. I think Prussia, my beloved Prussia, was kind of one of the last to do this. Like, Kaiser Wilhelm was still considered the supreme warlord, even up in World War One, which is a base sounding name. Like, Napoleon effectively was the last person to do this, to be an effective warrior king. Afterwards, it all just kind of became swallowed by the state and the expanding bureaucracy. And like, no offense, but in the 19th century, a lot of kings just started becoming kind of more and more insulated, and like, they weren't ruling so much as they were trying to manage an ever expanding bureaucratic system. And by World War One, despite Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas and a lot of the kings not wanting the war, the bureaucratic wheels and like the, I guess you could say, early military industrial complex were basically driving countries to war for them. And like, Kaiser Wilhelm, was horrified by the war, didn't want it, but Germany effectively became a military dictatorship once the war started, and he was almost powerless to do anything.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said about when you're not ruled by warriors, you become ruled either by merchants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like the former priest through the caste, which used to be in our older versions of our civilization, used to be the priest or pastor from your church who would take up that role. But like as society, especially Western Europe and America, became more secularized, everyone kind of went over to science, and like bureaucrats, right, and experts kind of took
It's
over that
everything.
role.
Everything had to become rationalized and like just maximum efficiency, but which is would have been okay if if you're still like Christian society, but then once you become fully secularized, it's like, okay, we want maximum efficiency, but maximum efficiency towards what? Like, what is all of this actually going towards? And it's like, and it and the answer today is just, well, to make a line go up and give people and make people consume and inject dopamine directly into their system as cheaply as possible.
Yeah, right. It's essentially like trying to keep, people consuming as much as possible because, what else is there
Mm-hmm.
in the system, right, to keep you, I guess, distracted from your ever declining life.
And it's like everyone talks about, well, the economy's still growing and all that, but it's like, okay, I get a cheaper iPhone, but housing, food, and like housing and food and gas are all going way up, and those are the things that are actually more necessary to live on. And okay, which makes everyone happy, which makes landlords happier. Again, it's the fact that everything that they criticized monarchists or monarchies and aristocracies of doing, we're doing tenfold in modern liberalism, and no one actually has the self awareness to understand that.
Well, no, that they don't understand the fact that like you're always going to be ruled by an elite class. Like the question at the end of the day is like, is that elite class that's going to rule over you have your interest at heart, right?
Mm-hmm. Or at least
Do they care about your people?
and there, like, there's that thing, right, about like medieval holidays where it said like the average medieval peasant had more days off than the average office worker, and it's like the concept that like the elites were all these incredibly corrupt, like self-indulgent psychopaths that were just like, we want to purposely we don't want our people to read, like we don't want our people to read because then they'll understand science. It's just like so ridiculous. But now, of course, with modern censorship, the liberal elites are literally doing that.
No, it comes full circle.
Well, yeah, it's not, and I'm wondering if and part of me thinks that people like Robespierre and Marat in France, that was kind of their intention all along of their vision of liberalism, because like they probably also had to understand that, well, you can't rely on the peasants to rule themselves. Lenin understood this, like the idea that there would have been some spontaneous uprising of the workers was just not going to happen. Like, no matter how bad things got in Russia, like, you still had a liberal class saying we can't end the war with Germany, and literally the only thing that stopped that was a communist takeover, and that was only possible because you had a vanguard ruling class that was ready to take over. Of course, that vanguard ruling class, much like our own, did not have the best interests of the Russian people at heart. They're actively killing millions of the Russian people and destroying their entire culture and spirituality. But they were able to actually do it because they understood that this populist thing of rule by the people just is a lie, and it's a comforting lie that people have to tell themselves.
No, and it's an amazing lie, right? And this is what voting does, right? It's the ritual of the lie, right? To
Mm-hmm.
make you, because it makes you think you have a voice when in actuality you don't have a voice at all. And it's just this false ritual you do to this like decaying system, right? That you pay homage to.
And the scary thing is that I pointed this out early on in my channel, that a lot of evangelical Christians had this weird thing where, like, I remember back then, like in the 2016 election, how a lot of evangelical leaders like were like, "Oh, you can't vote for Trump; he's bad, but you also can't vote for Hillary Clinton because of abortion, but you can't vote for any of these other candidates because they can't win." So they're basically saying, and they're like, "But you also have to vote, or like you're sinning because you're not rendering unto Caesar somehow." And you're just thinking, like, some of these people are just so addicted to Americanism as a religion that they're basically damning you no matter what you do when it comes to voting. And it's just like, it's a humiliation. It's why I can't do it anymore. I'm not gonna vote because I know what it really is a humiliation ritual, right? Because if you vote and your candidate loses because the election was fortified, or as my friend Arden says, there wasn't ethics in video game journalism, then you have no recourse to actually complain because, well, you had your chance and now all your rights get taken away. And it's like, is that really what democracy comes down to? And people say, well, we have the Constitution. Well, nobody believes in the Constitution anymore.
No, this is what I love about conservatives, right? Is that they're going to continue to flout out this like dead letter, and nail themselves to it, right? Because they still believe it like has some living, it's still living for some reason, and I guess it only lives in their minds, right? But like, kind of what matters here, right? The judges who enforce the laws, right, in the Supreme Court and our ruling class don't believe in it.
Mm-hmm. And
so
the
no matter
unelected,
how much these people want to prop this like letter up, it doesn't matter. They're not the ruling class who actually enforces that.
And you have this weird thing where the more widespread voting rights became, the less rights people ultimately end up having. Like, I don't think the Founding Fathers intended everybody to be allowed to vote. Not even just along, like, racial and sex lines, but just, like, what, you're letting, like, a random homeless guy on the street have the same, somebody who doesn't contribute anything to the society that they're in, it gets the same voice as somebody who, like, is a prominent, like, business owner that employs lots of people. Like, how is that fair?
And yeah, this was the argument about having land requirements, right? Originally with voting, that originally came with that, right? Was that like people with land are gonna have they're gonna have a stake in the system, right? Like if things start to go downhill, well, they own land in this country, they have family in this country, so they're gonna have an invested interest and incentive that like just like some random person who has no stake in the system at all.
And compare
just
that
vote for whatever they want.
Okay,
doesn't have.
And you have like the comparison of like, okay, some random Muslim immigrant in Europe, like, what stake do they have in the country that they live in other than to try and get as much welfare money out of it as possible until they can just create their own Islamic state within that country? Or you're like Bugman in America, who's just like, what investment do they have in the society they live in, are there other than like being able to participate in the religion of progressivism and more because a lot of them don't even get money from the government. I don't get money from the government, and it's just like, what stake do these people have in the society? Because they don't believe in anything.
Oh, the answer is zero. The only stake that they have is just the fact that like they're the low, unlike the Maslow's hierarchy of elite theory, right? The high, low versus the middle. We're kind of stuck in the middle here. The people who have just enough income that can have some influence, sort of elite thinkers, elite people who make the
midwits, right?
Yeah. But like aren't going to become elites who actually decide how the systems are run and governed. And like these people are just great for them, right? Because like what comes to my mind is like, that like tranny that like got put in the Biden administration, right?
Dylan Mulvaney?
No, it was Rachel Levine.
Okay, yeah.
Who's just like this absolute drag of society, right? And any like normal sane society would have been put into an insane asylum, right?
And then they parade them around as like they're the face of public health, and they're a decorated admiral or something. And it's just like it's these things are specifically made to humiliate the actual people, or to humiliate the average citizen. And like, it's also so much of the whole tearing down Confederate statues, right? We all know this has nothing to do with racial justice at all. It is a humiliation ritual, which is just to punish white Southerners for not voting for them. and for not shutting up and letting, the technocrats run everything. And
No,
it's
yeah,
it's like,
we're going to erase your culture. You're going to like it.
yeah, it's not to get too crass, but it's basically like a cuckold fetish, isn't it? It's like we expect you. The bugmen kind of know the government's like destroying their country, and they're expected to like that it's happening. And it's very disturbing because like the bugmen get like nothing out of this. Like they want all these like land acknowledgements and like all the mass immigration just because it makes them feel good because of a guilty conscience, or it's because it's because they're religious and they believe in progressivism as a religion. It's like that's what the religion says, is that non-white people are basically sacred cows, and we want more of them.
Yeah, this is why progressives have like this black people fetish, right? Where
Yeah,
black people can do nothing wrong.
black people are basically at the top of this, right? They're the darker your skin, the more sacred you are to progressives. And it's like they feed into like lying to black people all the time. Like if you asked a black person, I think a large number of black people probably think Wakanda's real. Like, and it's just because that's what the media told them. And they keep telling them the lies of like, hey, Britain was black for most of its history. It's like you have these weird historical revisionism where basically Britain was a multiracial society until like the 1800s, and then it wasn't, and now it is again. It's like that doesn't make any sense.
No, yeah, nothing makes sense in the current system at all.
And in a way,
like
it's almost like it's designed to not make sense, to keep people confused. I mean, it's the whole 1984 of the government could basically just say we're siding with one. This is our ally. It's like what? It's like Eurasia's our ally today, and then tomorrow, oh, they were never our ally. They've always been our enemy. And it's a thing with like Middle Eastern wars, right? Where, we're going to explicitly condemn nationalism along ethnic and religious lines. As soon as a certain country in the Middle East wants to do it, or Ukraine does it, then we're okay with it. And it's again, it's the elite policy of Western governments is to humiliate, deracinate, and just disarm, not just like literally, but spiritually as well, their native populations. And the whole thing of like, well, we can't let you be nationalistic or patriotic for your own country and your own people, but we'll let you do it for Israel and Ukraine. Or Gaza if you're on the left.
Yeah, we'll let you be patriotic or nationalistic. We're actually, remember when they were you remember this moment when they were like this, the borders of nations are sacred and must be protected, and Russia invaded Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Or that they don't believe in borders, but then when Russia invades Ukraine, they do.
Magically, borders exist.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, thousands of armed men from Palestine come into Israel and cause a lot of havoc. Well, Israel needs to fight back. They do the same thing in Europe, and no, you're racist if you complain. Like on Twitter, someone was saying like you can't compare the mass immigration to Europe to what happened in Israel. I'm like, you're right, it's worse, because Hamas is not going to replace the
it's
people.
Hezbollah
And Hamas, but they're not going to replace the Israeli people but Muslim immigrants have already replaced native Europeans. Like London isn't mostly British anymore. They're like a third of the population now. And it's like
they're a minority in their own capital city.
Yeah, and it's gonna be the whole country in like less than 50 years, because despite it being massively unpopular, the government, like, I have this thing where if like the tap the sign meme that Oren McIntyre likes to do, mine is like every economic and social issue and every economic, foreign policy and social issue can magically be solved by more immigration, it seems. Because that's the thing that's going to happen with Palestine, is if Israel occupies Gaza, where are the million Palestinians they're going to go? Well, if Egypt's not going to take them, and Jordan's not going to take them, Well, we're going to make Germany do it. And magically you have the fact that, well, all these Palestinians are evil Hamas terrorists when they're in Gaza, but they're peaceful immigrants when they're in Europe. And the Western governments are just going to eat this up hook, line, and sinker because they're like, we need more cheap labor for our underclass, and it'll take more votes away from right wing parties. And it's just like, at some point, I guess that we've been complaining for most of this, but I guess the transition is just kind of like, what do we do about it? Is like, where do you even start with trying to form a new noble class? And like, my thoughts is, well, you can start locally, right? Is try and find, and that's what I guess a lot of this project is, right? Is I want to get part of basket weaving that Distributus has been really championing, right? Is we live in a corpse of a civilization, and if we can try and create something out of that, a new civilization, however small it is, there's actually room for that. And also, according to polls, like, there is more and more, as things get worse and worse, people are going to get more and more interested or willing to accept other forms of government. Like, there was a poll that showed like 30 to 35% of Republican voters said that they would prefer a non-democratic system of government.
No, and we've seen this phenomenon happen in Europe too, where I think it was a couple months ago or whatever, but like, I believe 30 or 40% of Germany's youth wants a monarchy.
Mm-hmm. And if you took out the Muslim immigrant population, it would probably be even higher.
Probably would be the majority.
Mm-hmm. It's just saying, like, and like it's why, like, my issue, or the hard truth I say, is that as a monarchist, is the reason why monarchist parties and movements won't succeed is until they accept this truth, is that they're not going to go anywhere until somebody steps forward and says, I'm going to be the king. And if it's not going to be somebody from an ancient line in Europe who would almost certainly start getting arrested by the government if like a random Habsburg or Hohenzollern just said, look, things aren't working out, I want to advocate for a new system or to go back to monarchist rule, well, federal agents are probably going to show up at their house and they're going to be disowned by the rest of their family. And so somebody's going to have to be the Julius Caesar. Someone's going to have to be the person that shows up and just says, I am the ruler. And it might not be somebody from a noble family.
No, I think I agree with you. What they fundamentally need and what we lack is that, like, they have to fundamentally believe they have the right to rule. Because currently what we have is the progressives who firmly believe they have the right to rule over you and dictate how your life should be run morally and spiritually. And we have the right, in quotes, who believes they don't have the right to rule, which is why they're always subservient.
And they always lose because they won't.
Yeah.
Because they're going to shackle themselves to the Constitution and liberal principles, which says you can, or you'll have like the anti-Christian nationalists, right? Who are like, well, we can't get involved with politics, we just have to be nice, when it's like, they don't understand what politics is, and politics is about power. It's like, if you have your ideology and you want it to succeed, you need power. And the way you get that is, well, you get your power by any means necessary. Like,
politics is fundamentally about punishing your enemies and rewarding your friends.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, I don't like that. I would love to live in this world where you could just have, like, people agree peacefully, but because we live in a fallen world and have sinned, we don't. And so the next best thing is to mitigate that as much as possible. And when you have democracy, at best, you're going to have, as, like, Thomas Hobbes would have said, like, you're going to have, like, a million tyrants. It's better just to have, like, one tyrant than a million. Or what the reality is you just have them the drones follow whatever the ruling class says. And it's like, you have the feckless, like, I talk about this as the right-wing bugmen. Like, they're the ones that are kind of like the atheistic rednecks, right? Where they don't like Joe Biden, they didn't like Obama, but they don't actually believe in any, but they basically still fundamentally agree with their worldview. Like, just replace the Funko Pops with, like, posters of trucks and, like, the weird porn with more, I don't know, conventional porn, and you're basically looking at the same people. And the thing is that I can't blame them, because it's like, I think Lauren Baber, or some of these, like, right-wing elected officials just have, like, no class to them, right? It is... how can you expect people to act and behave in a more dignified way when everything they see in the media is the opposite of that? And it's like, you look at King Charles, as powerless as he is, like, when Queen Elizabeth died, her influence still got the native British population to come together and start singing and chanting without a thought, "God save the King." Just without a thought, there was still that loyalty. And you have the idea of, against this kind of faceless, godless technocracy, you have the alternative of your government is embodied and run by one person, a human. Like, you know who the king is. Their face is everywhere. Right? And it's like, in a way that kind of holds them more accountable, and it just kind of establishes the normality of, or it establishes the proper relationship to power, right? Of, you respect and obey the authority of the king. Why? Because he's the king. But in exchange, the king is looking out for your best interests. And, you know, as goofy as he might be at sometimes, I feel like King Charles just doesn't have absolute contempt for the British people the way, like, Rishi Sunak does. And also, King Charles is actually, you know, Christian and British. I mean, he's German, but, you know, he considers himself British. He's not from a foreign ethnicity.
No, there's that, like, fundamental in-group preference that he's just going to innately have that a foreigner like Rishi Sunak would never have and can never have. And that's what these assimilation people, you know, because for some reason these people still exist on our sphere, just like screech about, well, if you just assimilated them into American culture, they would be just like red-blooded Americans and love freedom and guns just like the rest of us.
It's why I can't believe in Vivek Ramaswamy, just because, like, okay, he says, like, you know, of my truths, God exists. And I'm like, you're Hindu, which God? and
isn't there like 22,000 of them?
Yeah, like, do I want the multi-armed blue one? Like, is that native to America? No. But at the same time, it's like, okay, lost my train of thought, but yeah, it's...
And even if assimilation was real, which it's not, what are they going to assimilate?
That's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say
Funko Pops and Marvel movies.
It's like you're basically, it's like they're asking the Muslim immigrants, saying, "All right, we want you to commit cultural suicide, and we want you to not have." It's like you tell immigrant parents, right? And you're like, okay, like, imagine if this is what happened when they got on the plane. They said, okay, when you get to Britain or when you get to France or Germany, here's what's gonna happen: is you're gonna come there, and you're going to be surrounded by a country and culture that's completely alien to you, that you probably hate, that has, like, mass liberalism and secularism. You're going to be in a place that you have no cultural or ethnic connection to whatsoever. Your children are, at best, either going to become radicalized by Salafist mosques that were funded by Saudi Arabia, or they're going to be complete liberal, like, shit-lib, bugmen, and you're not going to have...
Or they'll become trans.
And you're not, either way, you're not having your grandchildren are either going to kill themselves in suicide bombings, or they're not going to exist because your children won't have children. It's like, you think anyone would immigrate if that was their choice?
I can't think of any who would.
And the problem is, though, that the former choice is that a lot of the Muslims just become so insular that they just have their own colonies. Like, all those people protesting against decolonization or colonialism in Gaza and Palestine, it's like, first off, you didn't come up with those ideas. Your college professor told you them. You don't know what colonialism is, because if you did, you would realize that you're a colonist. Like, you think you care? You don't give a fuck about the native indigenous populations of the European countries you've invaded. So don't talk to me about colonialism.
No, and it's always this like preference for the foreigner to replace like that inherent in-group preference and nationalism that you would always have for your own people.
Mm.
Because in progressivism, that's a mortal sin. You cannot be a nationalist if you're white.
Mm.
So you must replace that with another foreign ethnic group.
You have to be, and it's like they're like, well, the best we can do is Ukraine. Why? Don't look up what the Azov Battalion is, and you had that ridiculous event, right, where a 98-year-old Waffen SS veteran got applauded by the Canadian government, and then people are immediately calling for that guy's death. I'm like, he was 98 years old. He was still probably a better man than any of you were. Because because World War II is the beginning event of modern history. It's like, they should probably, if they were honest, they would just say, we want to replace AD and BC with like after Hitler and before Hitler. And we don't teach about what happened before Hitler except for slavery bad. Because people have like, for people so obsessed with the Nazis in World War II, people sure don't know a heck of a lot about it, right? Like, they think it was this genuine, like, anybody that was siding on the Axis was just pure evil, and everybody on the Allied side was a saint, but no.
Well, no, they're just ignorant. They're just believing whatever they're told. You know, these like after Hitler, before Hitler people, as you quaintly put them. And this is what I was taught in high school, right? Was like essentially three things: black people are saints, evil racist white people, Hitler, and Martin Luther King, the triumph of diversity and progressivism, and that's basically it.
Mm-hmm.
That's modern education.
But we still live in a patriarchal racist society 70 years later.
But yet somehow, like, the right is still a threat, and like they're still in charge of everything.
Yes, every conservative, like, I was listening to just like this completely non-political podcast the other day or yesterday, and there's this guy talking about how I was on a plane with an annoying guy, and like he was like, this guy must have been the most racist person I've ever seen because he was just watching a lot of Charlie Kirk videos. And I'm like, dude, you think somebody who watches Charlie Kirk is the most racist person? I don't know. This is, in the words of Alex Jones, this is what they've done to these people. And it's just insane, right? It's somebody that we think, who has, I think, changed a good amount for the better, but still is like a very, very lukewarm conservative. These people genuinely think is like an SS officer.
Well, yeah, because in their worldview, he is. Mm-hmm. Like, anyone, like, to the right of, like, Karl Marx is a Nazi, and therefore is, like, justified in killing them. This is why, like, in every single modern movie in which white people are featured, like, they're always the villains, right? Because they're either Nazis,
there was
or
even
they're
that
white
movie,
Christians, and therefore you can kill them without remorse.
Yeah, and it's like, there was that movie Sisu that came out, I think, earlier this year. It was like, just, here's like the gore fest of a Finnish soldier killing a bunch of Nazis, completely ignoring the fact Finland was on the German side in World War II. I don't think the Germans ever occupied Finland. But it's just, we need to celebrate murdering Nazis, and who's a Nazi? Anybody we disagree with.
No, so that way, like, the system, like, has an inbuilt, like, radicalization mechanism.
And that's
like, has this inbuilt friend-enemy distinction.
And that's what makes it so funny of, like, when Canadian again, as you said, Canada, the most progressive country in the world, celebrated somebody who literally was in the SS because they're so stupid and nobody did the research. Now, again, I think a lot of the foreign... Okay, yeah, the SS obviously did a lot of horrible things, but... a lot of the foreign volunteers for it were doing so. They weren't signing up because, like, I want to kill all the Jews. They were doing it because I want I will do anything to stop Stalin because Stalin is a genocidal maniac, is this genocidal godless maniac who the only way we think we can get rid of him is if we march into Moscow and make him leave.
Well, yeah, people forget about like this, like, the Soviet Union, like in the interwar period, was not this like passive like state. Uh, it was engaged in border conflicts and like annexing land. And like these like Central and Eastern European states were constantly afraid they were going to be swallowed up, or like
Which
they were going to,
they,
they
which
were going
they,
to have a red revolution.
I mean, which they were because after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so in part it was Germany's fault in a way that the Baltic states were swallowed up. After the Russian Revolution, Ukraine was swallowed up, and you had the Holodomor, and then they tried to do it to Finland. Thankfully, Finland actually successfully enough resisted that they weren't able to annex the whole country. And it's like there's no reason why Finland wouldn't like. There's no reason Finland could possibly have allied against, like, what were they supposed to do, like, in World War II? It's like, okay, the Soviets already invaded us once and took some of our territory. They're going to want to come back after they deal with Hitler.
No, and that's the thing about these like dad types and like these other libtards is that they can't actually think in like a non-liberal framework or like like a real politique framework, right? Pure rational way of looking at politics and like geo things, because like Madman Hitler and like Nazism, must always come first in the progressive religion.
And of course, the conservative side does the exact same thing, right? The same exact people that will complain that the left just calls everyone they don't like Nazis will then call them Nazis because they have like socialist policies. And it's like, who cares about like specific economic policies when governments are actively trying to destroy their own people? Or at least, like, the government's not implementing social, like, in all honesty, like, on economic issues, I am more of a classical conservative. Like, I genuinely want, like, low taxes, low regulations, and whatnot. But, like, I understand there's bigger fish to fry, and the economic issues expand broader than just, like, what tax rate the government sets. Which, again, by the way, it's funny that we're paying infinitely more higher taxes now without our consent than we ever were under King George, right? It's like King George was not taxing us on land we owned. They weren't taxing us on our income. They were taxing us for like a few imported commodities. And people said, "Oh, that's enough to like try and overthrow the government." I'm like, "Geez, what would they think of now?"
It's hard to imagine, considering how cupped most of these, like, people who constantly LARP about 1776.
Like, yeah, like, the Tea Party didn't... The Tea Party accomplished absolutely nothing. It's because they don't understand what power is. And there's the fact that... hold on one second. Again, you get your ideas through because you're in power. That's the only thing you need to think of. Like, I haven't read it fully yet, but I gotta read more Machiavelli, right? Like, Machiavelli, understood the nature of power. And the ancients and medieval and pre-modern people, for all their own individual beliefs and ideologies, they understood where power came from and where power lies. Liberalism is just this kind of... It's basically like we've been smoking weed for the past 250 years, right? Where we just have to constantly lie to ourselves that says, well, no, like, the people have the power and, like, you have your voice in the government, but that's just not how it works. I mean, it can work briefly. It can work... John Adams said that the Constitution was explicitly made for a religious and moral people. And, of course, the problem is that, like, I don't think they understood the massive social and demographic changes. And that's the big failing of the Constitution. It's like, okay, if you have the American Founding Fathers in charge, they're at least not insane. But, like, they did it in France. And when your ruling class are completely insane bourgeois, look what happens. They marched nuns to their death.
Well, yeah, but like not also that, but like they were literally guillotining people every day in the streets. So,
And
you
it's this
know,
idea of like, oh, liberalism wins in the marketplace of ideas. Liberalism has only ever actually been implemented on large scale because of violence. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Second French Revolution, World War One, World War Two, were what made the world liberal, and that was only because democracy didn't win out over fascism because in a marketplace of ideas, Winston Churchill beat out Oswald Mosley. It won because America and the Soviet Union had more production capacity than Germany and Japan.
well, yeah.
And
Also, like people forget about they jailed their opponents as well and silenced
mm-hmm.
them.
Which Ukraine does and Israel does as well, but they need to be portrayed as liberals. So, but yeah, it's that it's like I've said this in my monarchism video, right? It's Jefferson said, "Oh, the tree of liberty needs to be watered with the blood of tyrants and patriots," but it's like, yeah, but it also apparently has been drowned in the blood of millions of innocent people, like including like Louis XVI was innocent. Like he didn't cause these issues. And he was still killed, and France was plunged into decades of bloodshed, violence, and chaos. And basically, the spiritual heart of France was ripped out, and not even like the Restoration could really fix it because they just overthrew him again in 1848.
No, that's why these ideas are so like subversive and terrible. It's because they poison the masses into believing.
It's a sweet tasting poison, right? It's the, oh, we're gonna do whatever the people want. We're gonna listen to the voice of the people, and it's like the average person already had places where they could voice their grievances, even under feudalism, right? Because the thing is, the local lord, it would often just be like the local lord in his little manor with his like 10 to 12 men at arms surrounded by a couple hundred peasants. Like, if the peasants were really mad, he'd probably have to listen to them.
Yeah, also, peasants were the ones who harvested the food of the society, so I think he would have to listen to them if they actually organized.
Which they basically did after the Black Plague, because wages had to be negotiated to be a lot higher because so many peasants died, but we're not allowed to talk about that. And the same thing is that, like, and it kind of just comes back to this, as I think we can start winding this conversation down, is that, like, the governments that people replace monarchies with, the grievances they have with the monarchies, the democratic governments have basically shown themselves to be 100,000 times worse at doing everything they thought that the king and the aristocrats were doing.
And there's zero upsides to it.
Yeah.
And like, here's the thing about like our modern example of democracy, right? Nobody knows who's actually running the country. You can't tell me who's running the United States right now. It's not Joe Biden. So who is it? Like, you can't tell because there's this giant smoke screen and like 2 million bureaucrats in DC who are running the system. Like, you can't honestly
who are
tell me
unelected,
who's running the
ironically.
United States. Yeah.
Who are unelected, ironically enough. And in a way, they almost work as a bureaucracy because a lot of them come from families that already worked in government bureaucracy.
So there's zero way to actually influence these people or remove them from office.
And you compare this to, okay, Napoleon, right? Which is very apt because, like, I'm excited to see his movie, the Ridley Scott movie coming up soon. But if you were to ask a Frenchman in 1805 who's in charge of France, they know who it is. If you were to ask a Prussian in like 1760 who's in charge, it's Frederick. Who's in charge of the Frankish Empire? It's Charlemagne. Who's in charge of Germany? Well, there's all the EU bureaucrats. Well, Schultz is like this kind of weirdo who looks like a goblin. Maybe he's in charge, but, we don't know. But and
he doesn't act like a sovereign.
No, none of these people do. Like, it's why I don't like seeing King Charles in a suit, because like the business suit, it's a great look if you're a businessman. It's a great look if you're a bureaucrat, because it's like it shows I have a professionalism. Like I am not part of politics. I am just this kind of faceless worker. Like I'm a faceless person there to make money, and that's fine. But I don't like seeing kings and presidents doing it. Right? It's I want somebody like that to be. I want them to be in the regalia. Like I said, this like do you know who Fulton Sheen is or was?
Yeah, I'm aware of the man.
Yeah, he was the Catholic. I don't know. Are you Catholic or Protestant?
Um, I'm either or at the moment.
Okay, but just not to put you on the spot, but it's like he was like the Catholic version of Billy Graham, like a great kind of mid-century Catholic televangelist. But he would go on stage on his TV show. That was the most popular show at the time in the 50s. Um, yeah, somebody in the chat said, "Imagine King Charles in plate armor and a sword. That would make an impression. Like that would impress people. Like his royal portrait with him and like Prince William and like younger Prince George all in their regalia. Like that makes an impression.
It's somebody who you want to fight for.
It's somebody who, yeah, you want to be loyal to. Because people need to be loyal to something, and when they're not, bad things happen. Our primary loyalty, obviously, should be to God, but, on Earth, we need a king. We have our king in heaven, but we need our king below as well. And, like, Fulton Sheen, just to finish that up, like, he would go out in his full, like, archbishop's regalia, and like he would speak so eloquently, but at the same time these people were more personable than our own politicians are. Like they would dress and look so above the people, but like there's this video I saw where King Charles is like walking around the Highlands of Scotland, and some bikers just kind of like were riding past and they just met with him and talked to him. They couldn't do that with Rishi Sunak. They couldn't do that with Macron. They couldn't do that with Joe Biden. But like, here's the king, the actual official head of state, part of a millennia-old dynasty, and like he's perfectly happy to talk with his own people and doesn't seem to show contempt. And it's like that's what real rulership is. It's being able to be. It's essentially it's being a father, right? It's you have the authority and you can display and show that authority, but a father also loves his children, and like. You like your dad as much as you're going to respect him in a good relationship. And that's essentially, and that's really what we need, right? Like we don't need somebody like we're ruled by a bunch of like single moms, both literally and figuratively. We're ruled by people that are like, oh, like we want to try and be cool, but we don't really have the resources and we don't really have that relationship that's necessary for flourishing. What we need is basically a dad. Now ultimately our father is in heaven, but on earth, like there needs to be a prince. There needs to be a king that is in command, who doesn't hate his people, and that people can he can be a symbol and a person to swear loyalty to. Who do we swear loyalty to now? People say, oh, the American flag. You can't, but the flag just represents the state. And the state is run by godless bureaucrats.
The state hates me and hates my people and my history. I have no loyalty to the state of America.
And it's the fact that it's like there is a point of like, do I feel like, because loyalty is incredibly important, especially among these circles, right? The problem is that, like, what we were supposed to be... Like, I am predominantly of Anglo-Saxon descent. Like, I am an ethnic American, if there is such a thing. Like, most of my ancestors came over from England in, like, the 1600s. Like, I can understand being loyal to, like, that concept of America, but nobody that is in power believes in that and has any interest in that. And so all it is just loyalty to an empty flag that's just flying, over a corpse, over a mountain of corpses, and just a throne of lies. Just it's all fake, and just it's not that I have to betray that. It's just whatever I'm supposed to betray doesn't even exist. Like we live in an ant that's been infected by the cordyceps. It's marching to its own death, and like we're asked to just kind of go along with it and pretend that the ant's still healthy.
Yeah, and that's why conservatism will always fail, right? Because fundamentally, conservatives try to conserve the system when in reality, like it's a zombie. I like that metaphor, right? Like this, like fungus just takes over its host, right, and eats its organs, right? We're still pretending like we can still save it somehow.
They think they can. They think they can steer the ant away when it's dead, and it's like what we need is like a healthy ant. What we need is the ants that just kind of because I think in that case there's like ants that understand what's happened to the other one and make the logical decision to walk away. I guess the last kind of animal example I'll use is wolves, because like I'm not a furry, just to give everyone that, but I find wolves a really awesome and fascinating animal, to the point where a few months ago I've donated to and symbolically have adopted a red wolf of a New York from the New York Wolf Conservation Center, because they're super endangered and super awesome animals. And like I posted this on Twitter a few days ago, that like neo-pagans like have this obsession of like, I want to be a wolf of Odin, not a lamb of God. And it's like, you don't know anything about wolves, because they think wolves are like these savage, individualistic, bloodthirsty killers. And it's like, no, that's what happens when they have rabies. Wolves in nature are super smart and super social animals that rely on a very strict pack structure, where they have there's the alpha, there's the dominant breeding pair and everybody else, and they all rely on each other. And it's like, wow, they have a better social structure. Yeah, people are saying a little furry reveal. Yeah, just because I like animals, shut up. But wolves like have this instinctual understanding of family and a social structure that keeps them safe and keeps them alive, and they tend to be very good parents relative to animals, right? They spend a lot of time raising their young. And the thing is that it's like wolves form these tight structures. Humans are the only animal that, at least in modern times, have decided that's a bad thing. Like we're basically wolves that decided we don't need a pack anymore. We don't need our dominant pair. And you know what happens to those wolves? Well, they either go off to find a pack that is, or they die. I don't want to die. And I think that's a good place to start wrapping this up, but yeah.
Well, in a healthy society, nobody would want to die, yet that's the trend we see overall, especially in my generation, is that many of them are committing suicide.
And again, it goes with the wolf. It's like a lone wolf is it's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction. Like, they need to be part of a pack. Humans are social animals. Like, we need a friend and family structure to be part of, and everything in modern society is basically going against that. And so, like, our society, it's not unhealthy. It's unnatural. It's just going against basic human needs, and it's not fulfilling them. To the point where our elites basically want us either brain dead or bodily dead.
That's very well put.
Yeah. And I think like the solution to that is you kind of ironic as much as I think populism doesn't work, you need to have a ground game of like, I don't know, just things you can do is volunteer, try and be as much a part of your local church community as you can, because churches are really good spots because they're people that you know share your values, at least spiritually. Try and conduct yourself in as noble and dignified a way as possible, because you know there is the idea that the noble mindset is something you can still share even if you're not of noble blood or in power. And people respect it when you act nobly, when you act with this kind of grace that is, it's above the people and society around you, but it doesn't have contempt for them either.
No, and I think that is something that we need to be cultivating, especially at a local
Mm-hmm.
kind of level, because that's kind of the only thing we really can do with the stage in the game, the stage of the Empire, is that kind of conserve our local communities and
Or at
being
least
a part of
conserve
our
aspects
communities.
of Western civilization that we want, because civilization's going to continue. Like, the death project of our elites is not going to happen. Like, okay, they can try and insert themselves into they can try and make themselves into brain in a jar as much as they want. I'm not going to be part of it, and I don't have to be part of it unless I agree to it.
Well, very few people want to be part of that system.
Unfortunately, a lot of people are just walking to it unintentionally, and you can't blame it because like whatever their because it's what their schools and media are constantly telling them to do. I was thinking about this as like if you were a kid in the early 2000s, so many of the kids cartoons were like talking about public school as like this nightmarish like cult factory, and I'm like, you know what, they were right. Like, if you ever heard of the show Codename Kids Next Door, have you heard of it?
Yes, I watched that show.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking like it's a really good cartoon from like the early 2000s, where the premise, of course, if you haven't seen it, is a bunch of like kids are like part of this essentially secret organization meant to fight like the abuses of adult society, like making you brush your teeth or making you go to school, stuff like that. But like there's a great episode, there's an episode, one of them is one of the characters is like forced into this like boarding school run by an evil old feminist, and she literally has a transgender gun that turns boys into girls, and it turns that into a dystopian future, which that's prophetic. But like and there's also an episode where the main character Nigel goes full Alex Jones on a conspiracy by adults to ruin the lives of children, and I'm thinking it's not much of a conspiracy now considering what happens at public schools. But yeah, I think this is a good conversation. It's helped me get a lot of what I wanted to talk about off my chest. I'm excited to watch more of your channel. If you ever want to have me on yours, I'd be happy to.
No, yes, I would love to have you on.
Yeah, do
I've
you
really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, sorry, we should have done this earlier. Just I was very tired from work that day. I was working very late, but yeah, any kind of final thoughts before I kind of close this out?
So my final thoughts on this are, I fully agree. We need a new aristocracy that fundamentally believes it has the right to rule, and fundamentally believes they rule over a people that are a people, and those people have a nation fundamentally at their core, and they have a higher spiritual value than just like the pure will to power, but they understand the pure will to power enough to govern the people they rule over benevolently, but not tyrannically. And anything is better than democracy. So I fully agree with that.
In all honesty, like if there was a benevolent enough sultan, I would be okay with that under the one condition that you respect the rights of Christians. But yeah, it's we want a king with God above, and with God as his father and the people as his children. We need it where God is, where we have a form of government that can reflect these the natural law.
It reflects the divine order.
Mm-hmm. Like Confucius understood this as well, right? His 5 relationships are based on this, and it's like his incredulity of the fact that people would say, "Well, we don't even need a king." He'd be like, "What are you talking about?" But yeah, that's what I'm saying is so yeah, everybody, thank you American Elitist for coming on. I'm glad we could have this talk. Everybody keep the faith, act with dignity, love God and love others, and have a good night.